Well, good afternoon and happy Sabbath, church family. It's a little week. Good afternoon and happy Sabbath, church family.
Happy Sabbath.
I hope none of you had too big of a lunch. I don't want any food comas going on. I understand some of you might be a little bit tired, but it's a sunny, warm day today. And I'm very thankful that we can be here today for the Sabbath. I'm realizing now, just looking at my slides, that I actually had the wrong presentation loaded. This is my autosave version. I'm going to exit out just real quickly. While I do, this is a world that is not, this is a day that is special not only to us as a Sabbath, but also a special day in the world's mind as well, as today is the commonly celebrated holiday of Valentine's Day. Now, Valentine's has some interesting originations. First of all, it's half of, well, at least the main reason that it's a modern holiday is because it used to be the ancient Roman pagan festival of Lupercalia, which was their festival on February the 14th, in which they would celebrate Cupid, who is the messenger of love, on behalf of Aphrodite, the goddess of beauty, or Diana, depending on if you spoke Greek or Latin. Either one of those. Of course, Diana, we know, is a part of some Bible stories that some of the worshipers of Diana actually were trying to end Paul's life and ministry because of the sale he had at the temple of Diana, the effects he had on the sale of idols at the temple of Diana. But despite this, there's also an interesting Christian background to the name Valentine. So even though this was a pagan festival, a day dedicated to love, there is a very interesting story about how Valentine's, the day that is often known by us as a day of love, came to be a recognized holiday according to that name. So Valentine was at least according to the history that remains to us, was a bishop just outside of Rome in a city called Equestria. Equestria is between Rome and what is modern-day Florence in Italy. He was a bishop there who was prominent for overseeing most of the churches in the northern half of the Italian peninsula. This was around 270 AD under the reign of Claudius II, who was not known for being an emperor friendly to the Christians. Claudius II was actually an openly gay emperor as well. He had a homosexual relationship. And perhaps this is one of the reasons, we're not exactly sure why, that Claudius formally banned the institution of marriage within the Roman Empire in 262 AD. Well, by 270, of course, Christians who still believed in marriage turned to their bishop, and their local bishop being Valentine, to still perform these ceremonies. And according to what we know about history, Valentine was approached by a pagan couple that, although they were not Christian, they wished to be married as well. And Valentine agreed to marry them. Well, the Roman Empire found out about this, and they decided, as soon as they found out that Valentine had been performing marriages, to call him in and formally dissolve all the marriages that he had performed. But when he refused to do so, they had him imprisoned to await his execution. Now here's where the story gets a little bit sketchy, and we don't know exactly what happened from this point on. Several people seem to indicate that Valentine, while he was in prison, wrote a letter to his daughter, his last surviving family member, which would be the original Valentine's note. It said, "From your Valentine." And in this, it claims that he said that of all God's cherished gifts, the institution of family is foremost. For this I would gladly die. We're not sure exactly if that's the case. It's also claimed that he healed the daughter of his jailer, Asterius. But nevertheless, we do know that in 270 AD, Valentine was beheaded for standing for God's gift of family. Now, I just mentioned this because last week we talked about the role of family. in the commandments. Honor your father and your mother, that your days may be long upon the land, which the Lord your God has given you. I will say that the family has come under attack today, and if we think to the original meaning of Valentine's, it's not just, if you look at the pagan holiday, it may be a day of Cupid and hearts and arrows through the hearts and crushes and all that kind of stuff. But if you look to the actual example of the person who the day was named after, it was a consecration to be willing to die for the Christian ideal of family. And I believe that more of that is needed in our world today, to stand up for family. And I am thankful, with that being said, that we have this church family here together. I pulled up the right presentation. Now I'm having a hard time. This wasn't actually the TV fault. This is just raw Nick mistake here. All right, I believe this will be it. Oh no. Is it 4? All right. This. And now my computer says it's connected. It was my fault. I got it set up all earlier and just set it up with the wrong presentation. All right. Now it says it's connected here. Here. It's 4, right? Well, today we are going to continue with our series through the Ten Commandments. I'm very excited for this part of the series, but before we begin, let's open with a word of prayer. Father in heaven, Lord, I ask that you can be with our hearts and our minds, that you could guide us through this study to reflect on what you would like to teach for us. Lord, we know that as we enter into your word, every time we must make a sacred commitment to not just have information enter our minds, but that our hearts will be open to you to be changed and transformed. So, Lord, before we open your word, I ask that you can help us to make this commitment. I ask this in Jesus' name. Amen. We're now on the Sixth Commandment. We've gone through a series on the commandments, and we've shown that although we're not saved by the commandments, although the Ten Commandments have sometimes been misused as they were by the Pharisees during Jesus' time, where they added a list of man's commandments on top of the Ten Commandments. While all that has been the case, we've looked at how the Ten Commandments are a remarkable description of the relationship God wants to have with us and the relationship God seeks us to have with others. We've looked at how these commandments are really a transcript of the character of God, and I hope you've been blessed as I have, studying together on the insights of what God really meant as he was writing these words. The only part of the Bible written with God's own finger. And today we're on the Sixth Commandment, one of the shortest, one of the simplest, Exodus 20 verse 13, you shall not murder. This is, in my mind, probably without a doubt, the most agreed upon and least controversial of all of the Ten Commandments. I imagine that most people who don't even believe in the Bible will agree that this rule is important. You shall not murder. As a matter of fact, I looked, and of all the civilizations that have existed in the last 712 years, there has not been a single nation without the law, you shall not murder. And I know most of us, when we look to the Ten Commandments, we might feel a little bit convicted reading a lot of the commandments. We read through them one by one, but we finally get to the Sixth Commandment and we're like, whew, finally one that I've kept. Finally, a commandment that I would never break. You shall not murder. Today, as we look at this commandment, however, we're going to see that it means something far deeper than what people often consider in the word, you shall not murder. There's a lot in the Bible written about this commandment, and a lot that we can apply for our lives today. There's a far greater extension to the story, you shall not murder, than just what appears in this page in Exodus 20, verse 13. And as we study this together, I hope that each one of us is impressed at the message of selflessness God is trying to impress upon us in this study. I like to tell a story. One of my favorite stories that I've ever read, although it's somewhat a difficult read as I was reading it, from a book called Touching the Void. It was a book that I read a few years ago, and the story has always deeply impressed me. Now, I know that some of it, for myself, is probably because I love mountains, and I love climbing mountains. And this is a story about two mountain climbers who were great friends and traveled the world climbing together. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have ever done any mountain or rock climbing before. I know Pastor Stewart has. So I just want to explain some of the most important tools you need to climb a mountain. The first that you need is, first of all, you need warm clothes. Normally pretty cold. You need food, you need water, anything you'd expect on a journey of some extent. But you need some specialized tools that are not found in other areas of exploration. One of the typical things you need is something called crampons. Crampons you strap onto the outside of your boots, and they are long, sharp metal spikes that give you grip and traction in ice and snow. It would be very hard to climb a mountain if you're sliding off of it all the time. And so crampons, these metal spikes that go on your feet, are extremely important. Another thing you need is an ice axe or an ice pick. These, you can see, are held in this hand, and you can burrow them into the ice, although usually not as deep as you might like to have them, and use these as another means of grip to climb. Helmets are usually recommended, anchors into the ice, a rope, but the most important tool is actually not an object. The most important tool in climbing a mountain is having a partner. Having a partner is essential because without having a partner, you could climb, you could have your rope and all your safety things, but if you fall and there's no one on the other end of the rope, none of that will do you any good. Having a partner is essential, someone there to catch you when you fall, someone there to pick you up when your life is on the line. These two friends, David and Yates, were very close friends and climbing partners. They wanted to summit a new mountain in the southern part of the Andes. I won't try to pronounce it, but it was a difficult mountain that had never been climbed before. At over 17,000 feet, it's about 3,000 feet higher than any mountain in the continental United States. So even if you were to go out to Colorado or California, to America's tallest mountains, it would still be higher than that. This mountain had never been climbed, even though many mountaineers had attempted it before. They had always had to abort out of it after a certain point. So Joe David, who wrote this story, talked about how he and his friend climbed up the mountain together. And in climbing, there is a few rules that are understood when you are climbing a mountain. The first of all is that when someone is injured, that you can do all you can to help them, but you should not try to risk your own life or the lives of others, because in one rescue mission, you might end up creating another. One of the harsh realities of climbing mountains is that partners are often forced to leave each other behind. They climbed this mountain for 3 days and faced a lot of unexpected success. As Simon Yates and Joe were climbing this mountain together, as they were getting towards the top, they started to get excited, knowing that this would be a feat published on the front pages of climbing magazines around the world. Finally, they got to the top. After a couple days, they took a picture together. They were celebrating for just a few hours, but they realized that they needed to get off the summit of the mountain quickly. In the distance, they could already see a storm brewing quickly in the mountains. And storms in the mountains aren't like storms down here. The winds can get upwards of 70 to 110 miles per hour. Temperatures can plummet below 35 degrees below zero. Plus, they were running out of food and water. So as Joe David and Simon Yates were making their way down the mountain, they were going along the ridge, when all of a sudden Joe stepped on what is called a cornice, which is a overhang of snow that can stick out over a ridge, but doesn't actually have any rock beneath supporting it. He stepped off, and as you might expect, slid off the edge of the mountain and tumbled for about 25 feet before his partner's rope finally caught him. But his crampons, those metal spikes on his left boot, got lodged in the ice while he was falling. And so his body was moving, but his foot was stuck. And as you can imagine, this was not good for his leg, which broke in 2 places. They were on the mountain top of one of the most dangerous mountains in the world, and one of them had broken his leg in 2 places. Imagine this situation. You know, often in survival stories, I'm reminded of what people will do for the sake of the sanctity of life. And it's often in these stories that people have to choose to confront harsh realities to either save or sacrifice someone else's life. One of the reasons that I bring up this story is oftentimes we think of murder in the sense that we see it in the world around us. That it's wanton, that it's senseless, that it's needless, and we can never put ourselves in the shoes of someone who would ever willingly take a life from someone else. But as we start to see in this story, sometimes we have to choose between risking our life for someone else's or focusing on preserving our own life. We'll come back to this story in just a minute, but I'd like to go to another Bible verse. Matthew chapter 5, verses 21 through 22. Matthew 5, 21 through 22. If you open your Bibles with me, this is from Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Jesus said, "You have heard that it was said to those of old, 'You shall not murder, and whoever murders will be in danger of the judgment.' But I say to you that whoever is angry with his brother without cause shall be in danger of the judgment. And whoever says to his brother, 'Raca,' shall be in danger of the council. But whoever says, 'You fool,' shall be in danger of hellfire. Therefore, if you bring your gift to the altar, and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift there before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother, and then come and offer your gift. Agree with your adversary quickly while you are on the way with him, lest your adversary deliver you to the judge, and the judge hand you over to the officer, and you be thrown into prison. Assuredly, I say to you, you will by no means get out of there until you have paid the last penny." Jesus here says that murder, the command to not murder, does not just extend to taking the life of someone else, but of harboring hatred and grudges in our heart. Perhaps this commandment is starting to hit a little bit closer to home. Do we ever have anger, a temper at someone else, a desire to lash out, a desire to subjugate one another? Here God says that it is impossible to worship him and still have grudges, grievances harbored in our heart. While many of us could not see ourselves going out and willfully taking the life of someone else, how many of us harbor inner hate and grudges towards one another? Another thing that I believe is an application of this commandment as well, that Jesus says to not only observe these things, but to observe what you see as well. There's an interesting connection done in a brain study. I thought this was interesting. Back in 2013, by the United States Mental Association and Health Board, when they reviewed the burst of technology that was being exposed specifically to young people. They conducted an interesting study in which they looked at the mental behaviors of killers and murderers and exposed them to the mental activity of someone who had a normal brain. Then they did something interesting. They took another normal brain and looked at the brain activity of those who watched violent movies or played violent video games, and discovered that while watching actions or pretending to do them online, that the person's brain was behaving as if they were committing the murder themselves. Now that's hard to imagine until you realize that in our world today, I know that there's a lot talked about in society that we won't get into today, about how one of the best ways to stop school shootings, mass shootings, would be to limit the amount of guns available to society. But we often neglect that the real problems may just be the people behind the trigger. Since the advent of violence being celebrated so visibly in our society, in our entertainment, and in our video games, it was found that out of the last 2,113 school shooters, 97.8% of them had daily played violent video games, first-person shooter games, or watched R and X-rated movies. 97.8% of them. So are we surprised when we develop these characters in a world of fantasy that they are expressed in the same way in reality? Should we as Christians be careful about the things that we watch, to not watch things that celebrate violence when we don't believe in violence? To not entertain ourselves with images and depictions of death when we don't believe in death, because as we have seen, that same character is being replicated in our minds while we're watching. There's another application of this commandment as well that may hit even closer to home, about another way in which this commandment to not murder can be expressed. In the Adventist Home, a book by Ellen White on how to foster principles of the home, she says this about gossip. She says, the spirit of gossip and talebearing is one of Satan's special agencies to sow discord and strife, to separate friends, and to undermine the faith of many in the truthfulness of our positions. We think with horror of the cannibal who feasts on the still warm and trembling flesh of his victim. But the results of this practice are more terrible than the agony and ruin caused by misrepresenting motive, blackening reputation, and dissecting of character. Death and life are in the power of the tongue. How often do we in conversation murder the reputation and character of others by tale-bearing, gossip, and and maybe even things that aren't true or we don't know are true? How often do we give into these conversations? You know, when I think about each one of these situations, I start to realize how easy it is sometimes for us to break the commandment against murdering just for the sake of meeting social expectations. I might think to myself, well, why should I let go of this grievance or this grudge when they've done so much to harm my life? And yet in our hearts, we are committing murder. Many of us think, why do I have to forsake the entertainment of the world and sacrifice this thing that I enjoy? Is that really breaking the commandment of murder? Do I have to stand up in a conversation where everyone else is gossiping about other people and saying things that we don't really know are even true? Do I have to be that awkward person to say, hey, we shouldn't really be talking about this? How much easier is it for me to go along with the flow? And yet, how often in doing that do we commit murder? We start to see that the command not to murder is an illustration of a choice between selflessness to live for others and for God, or if we choose to live for ourselves, no matter what we may think of our own morality, if we choose to live to ourselves in one way or another, we will end up taking from the lives of others. In our entertainment, in our grievances and grudges, in our conversations about the characters of others. If we do not live for others and for Christ, and live only for ourselves, we will end up costing the lives, reputation, and character of others. As Simon and Joe were up on the mountain, Joe had broken his leg in 2 pieces, and Simon had the interesting choice, whether he was going to live for his partner or live for himself. Whether he was going to live to save his friend or instead live to save himself. The storm was still coming up the mountain, and it was imperative that both of them get down as soon as possible or else risk freezing to death in the storm. There was a choice between selflessness and living for others or choosing to preserve his own life. Now, I know you may not be thinking now, well, this isn't really a life and death decision at this point, but we'll see how it would come to be. Simon ended up choosing to risk his own life to save his partner, Joe. And they developed a system. As you can imagine, it would be terribly hard to climb down a mountain with a broken leg. I'm sure many of us might struggle to climb down this mountain with 2 wholly functional legs, much less a leg broken in 2 places. This, after all, was one of the most difficult mountains in the world, and so they decided that they were going to climb around the clock. Now, normally how this would work is they would take turns lowering each other down the mountain, climbing around certain technical elements to find a good spot to lower each other even further. But now, Simon was going to have to do this all on his own. So here's what he did. He would dig a giant pit in the snow, and as he was in the pit in the snow, he would use the snow holding him in around him to lower his partner over the edge of an embankment. Lower him over the edge, as his friend was lowered all the way to the bottom of that embankment, to the end of the rope. His friend would then scoop a big hole in the snow while Simon climbed down. So when he got to the bottom, there was already another hole waiting for him, and he could lower his friend down some more. Does that make sense? They did this for 2 hours until the storm came upon them. It was about 3:45 in the afternoon. The storm hit in earnest so hard, however, that it robbed them of almost all light and visibility. They could only see an astonishing white cloud around them, and they started to lose track of where they were going, and yet they could not stop. They kept this system, but little did they know that instead of going down the less steep ridgeline, they were veering dangerously to the side of the mountain that led off to huge, several hundred-foot cliffs over a tall, towering glacier that cascaded down the mountain. It was about 9:30 that night. Joe had just dug another pit in the snow. They had just found another ledge. They couldn't see all the way to the bottom. It was dark. The snow was so thick that it had whited everything out. It was so dark that they couldn't really see, but they trusted that their rope would be long enough to make it to the bottom, this 300-foot rope that they had. And so Simon started lowering his friend Joe, lowered him slowly and slowly and slowly, but unfortunately, they got to the end of the rope before they got to the bottom. Now, there's a solution for this. There's something called handbrakes that can be made with ropes, whereby using certain ropes on your main rope, you can cinch your way and climb back up. And you can put your feet and elbows in the straps. And Simon attempted to do this. He attempted to climb back up the rope, just using his 2 arms and 1 leg. As he was trying to tie the handbrakes onto the main rope, however, he dropped one of them. He still had 2 more, and in order to ensure that he could get the second one on safely, he took off his glove, but lost his glove, and as he was trying to tie it, because his right hand was so numb, he lost the other handbrake as well. Now he was just hanging, cannot see what's above him, couldn't even see the cliff face that he had been lowered over, and could see nothing below him. It was as if he was just hanging in space, swinging in the wind on this rope. Joe drove in a stake around the top and started to try to create a pulley by which he could raise his friend. He had been working on this for about an hour and a half, when all of a sudden, the anchor that had been holding him in this giant pit of snow, having been warmed by his presence, started to melt. Inch by inch, he started sliding towards the edge of the cliff. And now it became important that he tried to spend time making the pulley to pull up his friend and save him, and risk his own life yet again, or should he take out his knife and cut the rope? Simon was down at the end of the rope and felt himself gradually inching further down and started to gain a picture of what might be happening up above. He had a feeling that his friend would be building some sort of a pulley system, but as he started inching further and further down, he started to realize that his friend might be struggling in this snow pit to keep traction. All of a sudden, Simon felt the rope go limp, go free, and he plummeted down below. Joe plummeted down below. Simon, who was up above, had cut the rope. All that night, Simon was unable to sleep. He couldn't keep going down the mountain. He was obviously very lost. And so he dug a snow cave into the side of the mountain and stayed there all night, but the wind outside sounded like screams. When it finally came morning time, just a few hours later, the storm had subsided enough, and as he looked over the edge, he realized that the cliff that was there was over 500 feet tall. And you could tell with his rope being 300 feet, and there being another 200 feet to the glacier that cascaded down the mountain below this cliff, that there was no way his friend had survived. He couldn't see any body because there was actually some deep crevasses in the glacier, or cracks that would go down into the ice several hundred feet. But he knew that his partner's body was lost somewhere down there. But as he started climbing down, regret filled his heart. Even though he had had fear in helping his partner earlier, there had been peace that came through helping someone else. Peace in risking his life with someone else. And yet, even though he had saved his own life, he had never felt such fear before. Even though he knew that the worst was behind him, the danger to his own life was behind him, he described in his book that an overwhelming sense of fear covered him. There was no peace. Despite the fact that he had saved his own life, he could not feel at peace with himself. He climbed down the mountain where there was a few people waiting in the base camp they had made together below. It took him about another 2 days to get down the mountain, but he was able to do so successfully. And as he waited at the bottom of the base camp for a window to open up in which they could descend into civilization, he could not eat and he could not sleep. But interestingly enough, the story of Joe, who had fallen so far, was not over. That same morning that Simon had woke up, Joe woke up as well. You see, he had fallen down onto what is known as an ice bridge, or a thin covering of ice and snow that is piled up over these deep crevasses. And sometimes in a storm, the ice actually freezes over these deep cracks that go into the glacier. It fell on this bridge of ice and snow and collapsed through it and slid another 150 feet to the bottom of this crevasse that worked its way down through the glacier. He had landed in about 32 feet of snow and buried himself almost 8 feet deep in it. Now, even though he was alive, he had broken 6 ribs, his back and his pelvis, his neck was fractured, his collarbone was fractured, both arms were broken, one both above and below the elbow, and the other one just below the elbow, and now both his legs were broken. It seemed that there was no part of Joe that ended up working. Joe feared the worst, that he had dragged his own friend over the edge. And he tried to pull in the rope as best he could, but with mixed emotions, somewhat a sense of relief, and somewhat a sense of betrayal. He found that the end of the rope was cut clean. For an hour or two, he lay crying in the snow, knowing that he would die in pain and agony at the bottom of the glacier. But instead, after a while, he thought to himself, I will do what I must to survive. So he decided to try to climb back. Here's an example of one of these crevasses in a glacier. He was going to try to climb back up the side. He made it, in his own words, about 11 inches before he realized that this was not going to be possible. And so he decided a new strategy to crawl deeper into the crevasse, to keep following it down the mountain, deeper and deeper. And it seemed that he lost all light that had come in from above. He went into some deep ice cave, but after crawling for over a day, he made it just half a mile out to the edge of the glacier, where this crevasse actually took him out down the mountain and put him eventually on top of the glacier. There he crawled for another 3 days. Crawled for 3 days, a grand total of 5.5 miles down the mountain. He made it back just outside the base camp when he could handle it no more. It was dark, but he could see the glow of the tents just over the rise where his partner and the people of the base camp had set their tents up. And so he started to call out his partner's name. Simon, Simon, over the wind. Simon was inside the tent and was having another one of his sleepless nights when he started to think that he heard, more of these wind-like noises, hearing a faint echo, not knowing that it was his friend's voice, cracked without having had water in days or food. He could not even recognize his friend's voice, but it sounded like the voice of a ghost calling his name faintly over the wind. He thought it was his conscience once again haunting him, but not being able to escape the feeling that someone was calling his name, he left his tent in the night and started to walk around the camp when he finally found the half-frozen corpse of his friend Joe. Joe was just barely breathing, still alive. Simon dragged him the rest of the way to the camp and got him medical attention almost immediately. And Joe ended up surviving. Not only did he survive, but as unadvised as this might be, he still climbs to this day. I think after an incident like that, that would be my sign to retire, but Joe still climbs even to this day. However, one thing has forever changed. Joe and Simon have never climbed together again. This story illustrates that many of us might put ourselves in Simon's shoes, on top of the mountain, being dragged to the edge. And while we all think that we like to think that we have not cut that rope on someone else, the tragic truth is that many of us do that all the time. When the choice is given to us to choose between our own lives or the lives of others, instead of giving ourselves in service to the Lord and others, many of us constantly choose to lift up ourselves, our pride, our reputation, our entertainment, our pleasure, even if it costs hurting others. But there is one person who did not make that choice. Jesus was being dragged to the edge by us. But Jesus chose to fall for us, to save our lives, rather than to save himself. Jesus chose to lay down his life for the sake of others. And unless we come to that willingness in our lives, selfishness will involve ourselves in the breaking of the Sixth Commandment in one way or another. Until we come to the willingness to say, Lord, I am willing to lay down my life and live, not just die, but live for you and for others. Until we come to that decision, there will be conflict of interest that leads us to murder in our heart, in our entertainment, in our speech, in our grievances, in our grudges, unless we choose to live as Christ lived. To rather lay down our life than to lay down the life of someone else. To choose self-denial over self-preservation. As we can see from this story as well, we might think that fear would come when our own life is at peril, and by relieving ourselves of safety, even at the sake of everyone else, we can obtain peace from that fear. And yet the Bible tells us that it is actually when we lay down our life for others that we end up experiencing peace. Christ calls us to follow him, to lay our lives down for him, and in doing so, we can find peace and salvation. Turn with me, if you will, to Matthew chapter 16. Matthew chapter 16. And we'll look at verse 24. Matthew 16:24, Jesus writes, or Jesus spoke this. Then Jesus said to his disciples, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross, and follow me. For whoever desires to save his life will lose it. But whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world, but loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? I don't know what it is today that God may be asking us to lay down. But too often we focus on preserving our lives, even at the sake of others. Preserving our pleasures in our entertainment, even if that entertainment is filled with the violence that this world is promoting. Our speech, even if it comes at the cost of someone else's character and reputation. In our grievances, in our relationships, do we often harbor hatred in our heart, being unwilling to lay this down at Jesus' feet? God is calling us to live not for ourselves, but to live for him and for others. To lay our lives down in service for him. Jesus would rather pay the penalty and save our lives, rather than sacrifice us for himself. Do we have that same heart as well? I'd like to invite you to stand now for our closing song. Trying to find the bulletin so I know what number it is.
336. I think I actually